I'm in the studios of the Real News in Baltimore.
In Baltimore. Does everyone know about the Real News?
Yes, the
Here
Real
on our
News
Twitch?
is the most real news that you could possibly get, and it's networked.
Well, I'm actually, I'm asking the people in the stream chat if they know what the Real News is. So we'll see if they already know who you are, but if you don't know the Real News, okay, well, check it out. It's great. Real News Network. It's a great place to get real news. How would you characterize what the work that you do there, Charles?
I am trying to promote our content on the internet.
Well, what kind of content do you do? I already know, but tell the people.
Sure. Well, we do a lot of interviews with activists. We recently interviewed Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies, talking about the Trump's peace agreement in Israel, which is essentially a peace agreement between Israeli fascists and American fascists that excludes the Palestinians. So it's, I guess you can tell.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I wasn't going to ask you personally about that, but we did talk about it at the top of the hour, and I think you would be, as Kelli pointed out, you would be the perfect person to ask.
Yeah, we have a lot. Anyway, we have a lot of guests from who are active in progressive or left-wing politics. Our goal is to.
Wait, are you skipping my question about?
No. I just wanted to finish the answer. That's what we do, and everyone can check us out on therealnews.com and see the programming that we have, and we have a YouTube channel as well.
Right. Kelli has put up the link in the stream chat, so it's therealnews.com.
Nice.
And Charles, what's your role over there, just so we know?
I'm the digital director, which means that to the extent that no one's heard of us, it's my fault.
Good to know. They have heard of you. They just didn't realize they had. This is what I'm hearing. So it's awesome to have you here. We have tons of questions. The first question from the people in the stream chat are, what kind of communist are you?
Well, I often do not use the word communist. That's more of a pejorative insult. Thank you very much.
Why?
Because if we're going into that sort of territory, I would say that definitions and words have changed their meaning over time. So the word communist used to have a much more specific meaning. It meant that you were a Marxist-Leninist whose sort of a family tree includes Marx and then Lenin and then a few weird offshoots involving Trotsky or Mao maybe. But today, I think it's an incoherent mess of people with radically different ideas and not very useful to explain what someone's politics are as a label.
So the question is then, what kind of reformer are you?
What kind of counter-revolutionary Kautskyist?
I believe they're asking you why you're a communist because we labeled that Charles Lenchner, the communist, is coming on the program.
Well, I hope everyone knows that was not my choice.
No, it was a joke.
Yeah. I would put it like this. I would say that I'm above all, I'm a Marxist who believes that, there are historical realities about how we progress as a society, as humanity, as a planet. And they have a lot of wide application. And in the United States right now, the cutting edge of that is groups like Democratic Socialists of America and candidates like Bernie Sanders. But it's really a Big Ten thing, and I'm happy with a lot of people who don't share my exact ideas on stuff. I think that the revolution will be won by people who make each other feel good and give each other back rubs.
Oh, well, actually, that goes straight into not the conversation about Israel, but it definitely goes straight into the conversation that we're having about what we wanted to talk about when you were here. You have a theory about how to look. We're all here at the same time. Isn't that exciting? I switched the view, so now you can see us all. You have a theory that we were briefly discussing. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you here was to talk about this. You're a representative for People for Bernie. I'm a founding member. Is that accurate?
I'm a founder. Yes.
You're a founder. Exactly. So we've got your People for Bernie, and we've got your Bernie, and we've got your Warren kind of people, and then we have your more mainstream, shall we call them, Democrats. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the way they are running their campaigns and what your thoughts are? And I'll just let you go from there because I know.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I just want to say to all of you, co-hosting with me and on the stream, that just in case you're politically wrong, I will make sure you have extra rations in the gulag. Like, it's all good.
Thank you.
We're very friendly. It's all good. But the way I see it is that Warren represented the part of the progressive world that is more comfortable fighting with and against the mainstream. These are folks who have a higher facility with the language of lobbying in DC, having meetings with legislators, raising money from well-connected donors. They're part of a complicated and very diverse structure that gives organized people a voice through those organizations where your budget matters and the celebrities matter. Bernie Sanders is not completely out of that world, but he's much more representative of progressives and left people and just regular folks who have progressive policy positions, but feel alienated from that world. They look at the world of mainstream politics, the kind of stuff that Political reports on, and they think, who are those bozos? I just want healthcare. Or they look at the machinations of organizations that engage in ongoing, efforts to get what they want, and they think, who the hell pays those people? I'm suspicious of them, but Bernie tells the truth, and I support what he says.
Yes.
And I think that would be the big distinction. And I don't know if anyone noticed, there was recently a list released by the Warren campaign of 3,000, leading progressives. Has anyone seen that?
No. What?
Well, shame on you all. There's this list of 3,000 people, and in tongue in cheek, as a joke, I call it the thirsty 3,000, because one of the hallmarks of the Warren campaign is they've done the work of figuring out who the most influential people they can find who have some kind of a following on social media or within an organization. They're a board member, especially if they're young, especially if they belong to a marginalized community, to kind of lift these people up and see the campaign as a way of doing that. This is not what Bernie does. Bernie's focus, in contrast to that, is to say, we're going to get a bunch of nobodies who usually don't vote to come out, and that's how I'm going to win. And I'm going to do that because by using those folks or working with those folks to win, I'm also guaranteeing a better chance of success against Trump. Because the only way that we can win against Trump in the states where it really matters is by getting people who don't normally participate in politics. And those people who don't normally participate in politics, whether they're right or left, they share a disdain for those of us that do.
Well, there's that. Trump has a lot of people who are following him,
Yes.
who like him, who also
The,
don't believe in
anger,
politics.
the anger at the swamp denizens is real, and it crosses political boundaries. And I think that, Bernie, by looking like he's uncomfortable in the clothes that he's wearing and hemming and hawing and sort of, jabbing his finger, is making it clear how much he dislikes being in the swamp. Whereas Warren, who often looks, really comfortable doing what she's doing and hanging out with various folks, today she released an ad where she's hobnobbing with Republican just plain folks. She looks a little bit too comfortable doing all that stuff, which wins her some support in some places and loses it elsewhere.
What do you see from your vantage point? Are there enough people who Bernie might be able to get out to vote who are non-voters to sway the election in his actual favor?
We don't know. We're going to find out in Iowa in less than a week if this is true. But even Iowa isn't really a good test because they use a caucus. So maybe there's something about getting a certain number of volunteers to do caucus things that is not representative of regular voters in a state like New Hampshire. But it means that by the time Iowa and New Hampshire is done, we will have answered the question, did Bernie get less likely voters to come out in large numbers and win? If the answer is yes, it will be huge ammunition for him to claim that he's more electable than anyone else in the field. But if the answer is no and he wins anyway, it's going to be very interesting.
Do you think that people who are, say, Biden supporters or Biden friendly or whomever else the other candidates are, Klobuchar, do you believe that they will get in step behind Bernie if Bernie is the candidate for the Democrats?
I think they'll run around saying you should vote for Bernie and make sure that you also elect other Democrats for other positions who are more mainstream or centrist in order to balance him out. And they'll make an argument that is pleasing to the establishment that don't worry, Bernie's just the president. We'll have a whole infrastructure in place to make sure he does that he doesn't do too much, that he won't be a bull in a china shop. And given the checks and balances of the American system, they're not wrong.
Ooh. Can you talk about, so Bernie Sanders is talking about the Democratic establishment's worst, that he says he's the Democratic establishment's worst nightmare. Do you think that that is true? And what about the Democratic establishment is most vulnerable in a Sanders presidency?
I think it is true. He's their worst nightmare, not because of how left-wing he is. Like Tulsi's not a nightmare because she can't win, because she
She's a
has,
nightmare just in
yeah,
general.
she has weird ties to, to all kinds of odd right-wing stuff, or India's Modi or whatever. So she's not really a danger. But Bernie,
Putin, whatever.
Bernie Bernie successfully captured the heart of just a huge swath of Americans, and not necessarily or specifically coasties who swim in the English departments of our fine grad schools across the country.
Huh.
And that is a danger. And there's a twofold danger. One of it is just his appeal to sort of just plain folks in states like Iowa and New Hampshire, but they of course suffer from their whiteness. They are unrepresentative of the Democratic coalition, Democratic voter coalition, which is often made up of communities that come together on the basis of identity and then jockey for position and resources as communities organized into verticals. So you have, Blacks, and you have Latinos, and you have LGBT. All these communities are basically part of a system in which they jockey for resources and influence. The problem is that Bernie isn't part of that system. He's not responsive to it. He never bends the knee. He never kisses the ring.
That's why we love him.
Well, but those constituencies, or at least the most visible leadership of those constituencies, is basically thinking to itself, well, then what power do we have? Like, sure, it's nice that Bernie supports LGBT stuff in general, but that doesn't answer the question of whether he's going to answer my phone call.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, for everyone to have the kind of rights and things that Bernie is promising, it requires all of us and all of everyone to kind of give up a bit of status
Yes.
and position, which is inherent in a socialist.
Yes. Basically, the vision of what progressive policy change looks like for Bernie is that everyone figured out all their stuff in a closed private room that top influencers are barred from. And then Bernie comes out alone on a stage and speaks directly to the people and says, here, comrades, my gift of progressive legislation that we shall now fight for. Whereas I would say the more Warrenish, more centrist, more traditional method is to have a room full of people who represent a rainbow of interests and constituencies who come together, and everyone gets 30 seconds to look good on camera. And I'm not saying that that's not how Bernie does his rallies too. You kind of have to, but like in their heart, that's not how Berniecrats think of what they're doing. They think of it as getting rid of the middle people in this process. The middle people being all the representatives of communities that have fought for decades to be seen as the representatives of those communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't you believe that on some level you you have run Organizing 2.0, so you know a lot about organizing. Don't you believe that there has to be some sort of leadership, or perhaps even just people who are good at organizing, who then rise to the forefront to be the voice of a community? Don't you believe that that's important?
So I'm going to talk for a second, but just so folks know, Organizing 2.0 is an annual conference in New York City that does training and organizing skills. But leaving that aside, I want to talk about big organizing or distributed organizing, which many folks heard about for the first time during the Bernie campaign of 2016. I'm not calling Warren a centrist. I included her as part of a larger group of how Democrats function, Mr. Decrypting. I do not think of Warren as a centrist. Love you, Warren. So the big organizing method is to basically turn to large numbers of people, often using digital means like email or text messaging, and inviting them to participate in this grand big project where we all come together to fight for something huge. And these are all good things. I don't want to sound like that's bad. But the methodology means that if someone is already a leader in a community, if they have an organization, if they have constituency, that doesn't matter. They don't get a special role. They're not tapped for leadership. They're not a spokesperson for their little corner of the universe. So that entire layer of people whose political project involves representing others is excluded from big organizing. excluded from distributed organizing. They don't matter. And that layer is literally the constituency that I believe has gone for Warren, because they want to matter. They want to be intermediaries in the way that power develops. And Bernie is cutting them out and developing a relationship between the leader at the top and then everyone else who just, gets on their app or text messages.
So we have Kelli with us, and we also have Jocelyn coming live from Iowa, and I want to get you guys in on the conversation, but I do want to ask this final question and then open it up to everyone, because it is great to have Charles here. He's such a vault of information and ideas. And also feel free in the chat if you have questions, comments. I see that you're lighting it up with questions and comments, and that's great. We'll try to pepper him with all of these. One of the questions I have for you, Charles, is the possibility that if the Democratic Party does go to Bernie, they're obviously likely to possibly lose their big corporate funders, and they'll have to go crawling back to labor and the people. Can you talk about what would happen in the Democratic Party if there is a Sanders presidency, in terms of who would be supporting them? And hopefully Sanders would do the first thing and fix campaign finance.
Well, I want to make a point about the funding stream, and I know there's a lot of talk about how the Democratic Party was dependent on maybe centrist millionaires and the wealthy and stuff like that. It's important to point out that, like, it's not like the Democrats said, "Hey, people who only want to give a little bit, fuck you, we'd rather take millionaire money." That's not what happened historically. What happened historically is that the Republicans started to raise vast amounts of money using both wealthy donors as well as mailing lists. They were experts in the 60s and 70s and 80s at figuring out how to get tons of money in all kinds of ways. The Democrats felt that they couldn't compete because our political system does require a lot of money in order to be competitive in a two-party system. The Democrats also were not as successful technically, logistically, at generating large amounts of money in small dollars. So their dependence on the wealthy was not a kind of ideological preference as much as folks that were losing, especially during the Reagan years, being like, okay, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we become competitive again? Now, that change that happened that led to lots of dinos, Democrats in name only, now we have a change. Bernie Sanders has led the way in small dollar donations. He has raised so much money, and others following in his footsteps, like AOC, have raised so much money that the calculus is changing. Now you have wealthy people saying, "Hey, what about us? We thought that we were securing a place in the political ecosystem by being your donor class. Now you're saying you don't need us." Bernie Sanders has raised hundreds of millions of dollars without having fundraising events in which important people get to hobnob with him. In fact, those of you who've been to events and seen the selfie line where Bernie Sanders, grumpy Bernie, he's like, takes your hand, your bag is held by some staff person, you take a photo, and he's doing 500 of those in 1 hour, right? That's not only like more democratic and grassroots, it's a fuck you to the wealthy and influential. Like, look at you. You're not getting special treatment now or ever again. It's a sea change. So I don't think this is reversible. There's just too much money in the hands of too many people. It reminds me a little bit of taxes. There's a reason why taxes go up on the middle class. There aren't enough rich people. As rich as they are, they don't actually have enough money to pay for everything. So I'm the same thing with political money.
Don't they just not pay their taxes? I mean,
a lot of them pay less than they should, especially corporations, but individuals who have a high income or who have a lot of wealth, they're still going to be paying at least 15%, which I think is the capital gains tax. Not as much as we'd like them to, but it's not accurate to conflate that with a corporation paying no taxes. All the people who made money in the corporation are still paying taxes.
Jocelyn and or Kelli, your thoughts. Jocelyn's coming live from Iowa, so she can give us an on-the-ground view of what's happening in the Bernie campaign. Jocelyn, do you think? Well, first I'll just open it up in case you wanna ask Charles anything, either of you.
Yes, I would like to say hello to my nemesis Charles. So nice.
Hello, gulag.
Wait, what? Am I in the gulag, or are we both in the gulag?
Just continue, but you're
All
the
four of
weather.
us.
The weather you're experiencing.
The gulag.
The weather there is good prep.
Are gulags weather dependent? Like, do they have to be in Soviet era Russia, or can they just be anywhere?
I think Alaska's a fine place for them. There's parts of the Dakotas that would be good. I think the Black Hills has enough space.
Nice. Well, that's hopeful. It's hopeful
It's
that there's
cold here in
some
Brooklyn
places
too.
yeah, exactly.
He's thought it out.
So Bernie campaign's doing great. As everybody knows, impeachment has made everything slightly interesting. So I'm volunteering with the advanced team, which means I'm helping set up events and, getting to be at all these events is very exciting. But normally Bernie would be here, right? Like, he can't because he's going impeaching Trump. So tomorrow, is that tomorrow? Yes, tomorrow we're going to be doing a concert with Jane Sanders in Des Moines, and I'm really excited about it. Canvassers are continuing to break records here. I don't remember what the number was yesterday, but it's like hundreds of thousands of doors are being knocked in the incredibly frigid weather out here in Iowa. People are committed. They are very committed. And I think I agree with everything Charles said. I think.
that's
Charles,
terrific.
is there anything I disagree with that you said? I'm trying to remember.
You want me to tell you whether or not you disagree with me or not. So
Yes, I feel like you should know me well enough to know whether or not I would disagree.
for your own long-term safety, the answer is no. You agree with everything I said. But
Kelly, do you have any thoughts or questions for Charles?
Yeah, I don't want these two to get into it too much.
I know. I'm like, let's just.
I think I was especially intrigued by Charles's comparison of the main progressives, which are Warren and Sanders, of course. And I think it was extremely nuanced and well thought out, and that is probably harder to do than in this kind of a platform. But I think both of them are kind of once in a lifetime politicians, in that I've seen the emotional connect they can make with their constituents or with the people who come to their rallies. So I think that that's a good thing. But a lot of people, the fact that these mainstream media types are so terrified of Bernie Sanders, in addition to his polling, which is quite good, is I think it's interesting, and I think it's a sign that Bernie Sanders is doing something right. That these people are afraid, the servants of the donor class, and like the New York magazine, Jonathan Chait is just, he's just apoplectic and terrified. And I think that, people didn't think Trump was going to make it. And I think people who are afraid of Bernie not making it are probably going to be surprised. So,
people have said that the U.S. is a country of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. They just happen to not be rich at the moment, but just wait. And I think that's starting to change. So many medical related bankruptcies, so many people with credit card debt that eats up more than half their income, so many people who have to go back to live with others or back in their parents because they can't afford market rate housing. At some point, you're like, God damn it, not only am I not going to be rich someday, but I now understand that the wealthy are a parasite class preventing me from having a life of dignity.
Yeah, I agree so much with what you're saying, Charles, especially having been involved with Professor Wolf and Harriet and their Democracy at Work group, and him always talking about how surprised he is that these ideas around socialism are actually catching on, and her work talking to people about how people's personal problems are all like within a system, within a construct, within a capitalist system, and people need to be aware of that. And I think they are becoming aware of that. And some of those structures of thinking like, oh, if I achieve XYZ, then I am a worthwhile person, people are starting to become empowered. No, I'm a worthwhile person, and why do I not have health care? It's really people sort of becoming more empowered in their own sense of selves, and not just buying into like what capitalism is selling them. Back to the question that was raised by both Jocelyn and Kelly. You talked about well, I just want to get to your article about finger waggers versus fist raisers. Can you talk a little bit about the thing that you're working on now?
Yes. Okay. So this is for my own benefit, and I'm not sure where it's going, but I was really thinking hard about this difference between the Bernie Sanders troops and the other progressives who see him as a kind of enemy. And the Joe Rogan kerfuffle sort of brought this into relief. Here we have a guy who is clearly friends with some alt-right folks, who's expressed horrific anti-trans and anti-women and anti-Muslim. He said some reprehensible things.
Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan, right? A podcaster with a vast, large audience, right? He comes over and says, even though I have all these terrible views, and even though I have all these terrible friends, I want to support the most left-leaning candidate in the race because fuck this shit. Let's have a radical change and make everyone's lives better. And this mass wave of revulsion erupts, saying, "How dare you? How do we stop this from happening?" And the argument was something like, okay, it's fine if Joe Rogan wants to be a loser and support Bernie Sanders, whatever. But how dare Bernie publicly embrace him by releasing this video? So that mode of reaction, that mode of watching a political event happening, and it's like they all pull out of the holster. It's the finger. How dare you? How could you have said that? Here's a quote from something he said in 2006. He's got the wrong position on stuff. That finger wag impulse is something that I was very interested in. I want to understand it as deeply as possible, not just to condemn it, which is easy, and a lot of Bernie people do. More like, why does this happen? Why does it feel to so many people like that's a reasonable thing to do? Now, I have some answers that I've come up with, but I'd love to find out what let's see, who's a good wokatarian here? Jocelyn, Kelli, why do you think this finger wag is such a knee-jerk response for so many folks?
I would like to, first of all, thank you for the wokatarian thing, which I'm sure was a compliment. And
I just want to point out, this is an all-white panel. Shame on you.
I mean, Charles,
You're Jewish.
Can you see my eyes roll?
Okay.
White people were only considered white from 1968 on.
I hate to disappoint Charles for what I think he hopes is spicier commentary on this topic. Look, I think that I've been backpedaling to understand the Joe Rogan thing because for obvious reasons, I'm not one of his fans, but I do think that, both sides though, okay? I think if it's the case that this person is an avowed racist, Alex Jones apologist and stuff, I can understand the argument that promoting him even subtly could hurt certain people. I understand that argument. And also, I do think the fact that we're focusing on it this much is not really about the thing. It's about the finger wag impulse that Charles is addressing. I think that the reality is Bernie freaks people out so much, and people are waiting for him to do things that are going to embolden their preconceived notion of him as I don't even understand, like a misogynist, socialist, Bernie bro creating horrible thing. And so was it great to make a Joe Rogan video? I actually don't know. I mean, that's not really, I don't think I have the background on this situation to speak to that, but I do think the fury about it is outsized, given that problematic people are uplifted by campaigns all the time.
Look,
that's a great point, Jocelyn, about how problematic people are uplifted by campaigns. You're seeing that on the street now. I also think the finger wagging isn't politically, they're not thinking about politics. They're just thinking about morality. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. Da, da, da. But isn't it, if you want your candidate to win, isn't it pragmatic to think, hey, maybe Joe Rogan will get some of those Trump people who just voted for Trump because they want to fuck up the system, to fuck up the system in the other way.
I just want to point out, Julianna, that your resort to logic and rational arguments is symptomatic of a oppressive male mode of engaging in politics, and you are hereby denounced for it.
I'm sorry.
But
don't you dare say that it's women who are wagging their fingers and being emotional and radical. I think not.
But here's what the thing. I want to talk about where this comes from. And this is my theory. And I'm not an academic or a sociologist, so I could totally be wrong. And that's why I'm talking about it, to find out how I'm wrong. My theory
I am an academic, so I'll tell you how
Thank
wrong
you.
you are.
I just like to appreciate that Charles admitted he could be wrong about something on the air. But
I often am. Let's just be straight about here. So here's the thing. In the 1970s, you had an American left, a radical left, that went from thinking a revolution is imminent to realizing that no one cared and pot was cool. The 80s brought Reagan. The left was incredibly weak during this time period. they retrenched and figured out that the one place where they had any power at all was college towns and universities. They had a certain amount of cultural influence in places like Hollywood or Manhattan, and that was it. They weren't winning elections. They had very few champions. So when they're in that mode, they started to ask the question, how do we exert power anyway? And the answer was change the language. Use tactics like name and shame. Get people to start reflecting changes in society through how they talked and how they addressed the issues. And by burrowing into how schools teach kids, how universities enforce codes, they were going to have a widespread cultural impact. And they're not completely wrong. If you look at the trajectory of feminism or of more acceptance for LGBT and trans rights, this may have actually been really key. But it's coming from a position of weakness. There's a difference between winning an election and getting people to not use certain words. There's a difference between winning a strike or organizing an industry and getting kids to remember that Columbus wasn't a good guy. And I think that there's an instinct that's built into our progressive politics to act from that place of weakness and focus on the moral position, the language that's used, and dig up things people have said in the past. And it's filling up the space that ought to be occupied by people going out there and winning. So that's why I make the contrast between the finger wag and the raised fist. And the raised fist is the mode of the Bernie campaign, and the finger wag is the mode of the wokeitarian.
Now I'm really mad you called me a wokeitarian, because I'm definitely a raised fist. WTF, Charles.
Oh my God, I was so insulted that you called me not a wokeitarian, and now I feel like I won.
What is this? Like, this
I just like to point out that WTF is the acronym for wag the finger. So you go.
Yeah,
that's also wokeitarian fuck.
No, I totally agree. So I agree with Charles. And I also think that there's a psychological dynamic called learned helplessness, where if you have been put in a situation that is vulnerable, even if you were legitimately vulnerable at that time, you then can become addicted to the power that comes through vulnerability. And the problem with that is it's not like, and this plays out in personal relationships, it plays out in political dynamics. You don't win by appealing to the morality of your oppressors, ever. Like, literally ever. You might, so this is funny. I saw someone on Facebook once be like, yeah, like, I sat down with Steve King and like we had a great conversation and like blah blah blah. I'm like, all right, what do you think that accomplished? Like, congratulations on your weird creepy copy date, but like, you know how we're gonna get Steve King to shut up? Vote him out of office. Like, that is how. And I think about power dynamics a lot, because I obviously want as much power and influence as possible. But the reality is, like, people don't like to talk about power dynamics. We're allergic to that, especially on the left, where we think our power comes from, like, wow, like, we're the oppressed ones. Like, things are bad for us. It's important to talk about that for reasons that are therapeutic and for reasons that are political. But the end goal of talking about that should be a more equal power structure, not just an increased conversation about vulnerability.
Well, but there's an important element here, and this is something I'm trying to figure out how to talk about, because it's a bad look for me to say these things. The strategies that come from being vulnerable, the strategies that emerge out of weakness, are strongly related to how women historically have used power. So women who, until fairly recently, grew up in a world where men, especially white men of wealth, dominate, they were able to exert power on each other and their families and society by invoking that morality, by invoking that higher power to lean onto that isn't their own power. In other words, the use of the trope of, you have failed morally, I'm going to shame you until you adjust your behavior, that's the language of prohibition from the anti-alcohol fight. That's not the language of baseball bats that were used in the labor struggle. And I think that we have to recognize that it went too far. We need to make a shift. We need women to be wielding the baseball bat.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So oh my God. Thank you, Charles, for opening up something that I want to talk about for hours and hours.
Thank God this is Twitch, where we can just get on here and talk for hours and hours.
So I do think that there is a generational dynamic that's going to shift that, right? Because so my mom was raised by a stay-home mother who, relied financially on But I was raised by a stay-home mom with anger issues. So like I like, you know, who like is very professionally and financially independent and competent. And that is true of a lot of women in my generation. Like we were raised by women who either worked or were professionals, or at least were a lot more assertive and in command of their power. And so my hope for this situation is that we move into a place in the movement where methods of feminine being, which are also powerful, you know, communication, community building, like those are powerful skills. But I do agree with Charles. You also need to be able to beat the shit out of people. And like, I don't think it's one or the other. There are a lot of psychological studies about this idea of personality androgyny, which is the idea that people can be the people who are able to inhabit nurturing emotional spaces and also masculine assertive spaces actually are more psychologically stable.
Oh my God, that's me. I thought I was less
Wait,
psychologically
would you repeat that again, but use shorter words?
Wow. That was me using shorter words. All right, I'm gonna try this again.
Just not very smart.
Whatever, don't bullshit me, Charles. Okay.
I want to hear this.
So there is a woman, I'll look up her name, but she's really fascinating. And she was really interested in ideas of traditional gendered personality traits. So like the masculine ones being assertive and anger and that kind of communication, and the feminine ones being, you know, more verbal complexity, more emotional complexity. And she found that people of all genders who could inhabit both sides of this spectrum, both the like, you know, emotionally nurturing one and like, I will fuck you up, are actually healthier because you need both. You know what I mean? There are times when you need to be comforting, and there are times when you need to, you know, threaten your ex with legal action if he doesn't give you your rent back. Like,
No, Jocelyn, I want to chime in. That is such a great thing, because I think that women are specifically made to feel, and men the opposite, you know, something's wrong with you men if you have a nurturing side, and something's wrong with you women if you know, have an aggressive side. And I'd like to add that fuck. So just,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think, you know,
But I want to raise a voice here for a community that's often not given its due, which is the group of people that suffer from mild autism, people who know in advance that their social skills are not great and have to survive in a world where the people who have the best social skills, either in the male form or the feminine form, are going to get ahead. And for folks like that, what's really important is figuring out what the rules are. And part of the problem in politics is that people invoke rules when it serves them and ignore them when it doesn't. They say, oh, we want to have a strong leader who does this thing, and if it's a woman, it's great. And then a man does the exact same thing and it's bad. And that kind of shifting of who gets to do what and where based on who you are, sort of standpoint theory, where you're only legitimate in what you do and say because of your identity, this means that there are no rules. It means that it's entirely based on the power dynamics of any given moment, which leaves a huge percentage of the population being like, fuck, how do I participate in this game at all? Like, I'm never going to be good enough in terms of my identity or in terms of my awareness of what's going on to be a full participant in that stuff. And believe it or not, I think that's a big chunk of the voting population that looks at all these people on media and politics and the swamp and successful people, and they say, who's going to speak up for me who has a foot in his mouth all the time?
I have a question here, people. That we've got a bunch of questions in the stream chat, and I would like to make sure that they get to pepper Charles with the stream chat. Mr. Decrypting says, if he, meaning you, Charles, wants women wielding the baseball bat, then I'm curious why opt for Sanders over Warren? What does he see as the main political differences between the two that made him opt for Sanders, given that he does appear to be a supporter of both?
First of all, I want to say I am not one of the Bernie supporters who runs around bad-mouthing Warren. So I actually try and avoid engage. I don't think there's any benefit to Team Bernie to run around persuading supporters of Warren why they should switch over. It makes no sense to me. I think our main enemy for both camps is Biden and Buttigieg, and that's the most important thing. That said, I do have a preference for one over the other. And it goes like this. If you look at the world that Warren inhabits, who her campaign staff are, who she works with, there is a ton of people who grew up under a Clinton or an Obama machine. She is comfortable with the mechanics of power in Washington, D.C. It's true that she's often used her voice to sort of denounce that system, but on a personnel level, like Joe Rossbars as one of her main campaign people, like this is the world that she inhabits. So there's going to be an impact down the road of being accountable to those people who are right there with you in the executive table where all the decisions gets made. Meanwhile, Warren is up in Vermont with a bunch of weirdo wackos. I mean, Nina Turner, what the hell? Roseanne DeMoro from formerly of National Nurses United. These are ferocious people who don't give a fuck about any of that. These are people who've cut their ties to the establishment, who can't be bullied or challenged. Bernie surrounds himself with people who literally don't have anything hanging over their heads, no career trajectory that depends on those denizens of the swamp in DC and the lobbyists and the donors and the infrastructures. So I'm really excited to see what happens when they finally get some real power and start to fuck shit up. I don't think they'll be able to do as much as they want because we have a system of checks and balances that makes that really hard. But I trust that their instinct at all times is to serve a policy agenda and not to be welcome at a dinner party. And I do not feel the same way about Warren and her people.
Oh, yeah.
Well put.
It goes back to what Jocelyn was saying about how, it's really the trait and not necessarily the gender.
Like, I also love Elizabeth Warren, I like, how could you not? She's Elizabeth Warren. Like, every time I see her, I'm like, oh, adopt me. But however, you can't argue with the fact that Bernie is less of the establishment candidate. Like, it's weird that we have to have this conversation because, and people make it like about gender and like, okay, sure. Structural misogyny is always going to be with us, like original sin. It is very bad and we should talk about it a lot. However, that doesn't mean, like, as I say pretty much every Twitch stream, I would love it if Bernie Sanders were a Black queer trans woman or something, and then we could have a conversation. But he's not. But he's also one of the first Jewish candidates we've ever had to do this well. So, like, if you guys want to check your little identity.
Jocelyn, listen. Check your Gentile privilege, okay? I'm Jewish. Let me drop some knowledge on you.
About it.
Our rule needs to be hidden. Having Bernie as a Jewish candidate is not a plus. All right? We should actually be conspiring to have non-Jews do massive changes in America and reorder our social and economic system. The fact that a Jew is leading it is a danger, not a promise. Okay.
Is this why
I have a thought that I'd like to throw in and get y'all's. See, people are functioning under the idea. I know we kind of work in a little bubble because a lot of us like Bernie, and a lot of the people in our stream chat, I never have anyone who's like Biden, are Bernie people. And so there is this basic assumption that we're relying on that, like, Bernie's outside of the mainstream, he's outside of the thing, and that's why he's good, which is true. But there are a lot of voters who believe that, his type of change would be too disruptive for the system that we're currently in. And they believe in a more moderate type of change, which is why they like Warren, because she offers the most progressive of a moderate type of change. This is a valid concern, because if you look at other revolutions, sometimes they turn out in the exact opposite way that you were trying to go.
But think of it this way: the same people who will say, when talking about politics and cultural change, stop trying to appeal to the comfort of the white working class or white people or men, like stop centering what they like and don't like, are perfectly fine praising Warren for not violating the comfort level of our top 1% or 10% or 15%. It really is a question of whose comfort you're going to value the most. And I think that what Warren's doing is he's making a very clear distinction between the opinions of the self-appointed elites and cultural guardians and finger waggers of this country and the people who just want their fucking cancer cured without losing the house. And I think that sort of binary that he has been pressing forward doesn't make him a radical. Like, what has he talked about? 5-year plans? We can nationalize heavy industry. All the things I'd put on my list are things he never talks about at all. Instead, he's saying, could we take things that 60 or 70% of all Americans actually want in poll after poll for decades and ram that through the swamp in DC and not let those people saying, oh, but what about the people who have dinner parties? They're not going to like it. They're going to resist him. This is bad. It's too much change. And all I'm thinking of is, you will have to have a little bit less steak, you fuckers. It's a good thing.
I know, but there's a lot of fuckers out there.
Okay,
Well-
I also want to talk about something that I think is really interesting, and I've noticed it like my entire sentient life. There is a type of person who hates poor people, but doesn't know that they hate poor people. So what they're going to do is say like, oh, like, I don't like that male-centered, Trump apologist thing. Because here's the thing. Guess where their most gendered communities in America are? The poor. There is this I took this amazing class on the cultural implications of wealth. And one of the things it said is like in upper class families, the person who has the money has the power, at least in our modern age. Look, that's true of my family. Like my mom makes more money than any of my other parents. Like, and so she's in charge. And that's like, but if you go into small communities in America, yes, they are still adhering to very traditional gender dynamics. And yes, that means the media they consume might be more gendered and maybe a little bit more misogynist. And like, I don't love that. I don't think that's great. But the way you change that is college for all. You change that with more opportunities. You change that with more economic stability. But it's really fun and really comfortable for a specific type of elite to talk about like gender dynamics among wealthy people and be like, oh, this really accomplished woman is, better than this other guy. And that is a conversation I think we should definitely have, but not when you're doing it because you're classist.
You're taking two conversations and you're mashing them up in a way. I'm not saying it's bad, but you're doing it. One of them is this cultural conversation about gender dynamics. Even the phrase gender dynamics will get you laughed at Denny's restaurants throughout the country.
That's what I'm trying to say, Charles.
Yeah.
Go to
I'm with you. But then the other side of it has to
That's
do with this objective question, like, where are we moving? Where's the working class? And I want to bring back Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan, who said some horrifically anti-trans things. Let's be clear. Joe Rogan thinks you should use whatever bathroom you want, isn't against healthcare for transgender people to help with their transition or hormone replacement therapy, whatever, is not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to join the military, is not saying they shouldn't get civil rights protections. The one issue that he's been terrible on is because he's an athlete from MMA, he got really upset because in 2006, someone transitioned from being a man to a woman and then competed or wanted to compete against women who were assigned female at birth. And he thought that this was some sort of big problem. I mean, it's an issue. It's not a non-issue. And the way he addressed it was insulting and not with the times. Like, oh my God, this guy is sort of okay with 9/10 of the agenda and is terrible on the 10th. Maybe if we just wait a little bit, he'll come on board. There's a sense of the left turning to millions of people who are making enormous strides in their tolerance and acceptance of this country's diversity. And we find the one thing that they're still bad at, and we use that to define who they are. This is the opposite of love the sin or hate the sin. This is whatever mote in your eye still exists, that's who you are. Fuck you. Out comes the finger.
But see, I don't think I was mashing things together, because what I'm trying to say is this is directly related to the kind of communities and cultural conversations you were exposed to. Like, I don't buy into the like liberal elites on college campuses, because look, we know for a fact that higher income voters voted for Trump at an alarming rate. So I don't think it's that simple, but I do think like at the end of the day, so again, I'm from Southern Virginia. I will have people call me up and legitimately ask me to explain things like trans rights to them because they don't know. Like, they're not.
One of my best friends from college called me, like, I think it might have been as long ago as like 6 years ago. I remember this so clearly because I was shopping for shoes at Union Square. He calls me up and he's like, Charles, look, I have this problem. I'm like, what is it? He's like, I think I'm against trans people. And I can see that people I know are like, thinking that I'm awful. And I'm and he was genuinely in this moment of like, what do I do? I want to be on the right side of stuff, but I feel like it's really wrong to just make everyone suddenly change the signs on the bathrooms or whatever. And I remember saying to him, I said, listen, Chris, like, you're a good person. And I know that if you were dealing with anyone on an individual level, that you would be kind and thoughtful to them to the best of your ability. And he's like, yeah, but that doesn't seem to matter. I was like, well, actually, it matters most of all. And I believe that if you just give yourself permission to be who you are and to have the opinions that you do, even if they're not the most, radical left in the world, I think that eventually you'll settle on stuff that makes sense for you. So a few years after that, he comes back to me and he's like, I get it now. It all makes sense. And he had changed his opinions on this topic in a really radical way, not because people were haranguing him, but because people were giving him the space to evolve. And I think that muscle that on the left barely exists because of that finger.
Sorry, I was on mute. So you're bringing up something, Charles, that's really important.
Like, does Kelli have anything to say? She's been quietly sitting in the top left corner.
No, it's hard with these heavy hitters. I will say that in our leftist movement, the finger waggers are disproportionately represented, and I think we all know
on Twitter.
Yeah, and they're in social media and in DSA meetings. So that's definitely something, and it's interesting because this is a conversation they do not have on the right. I mean, they have all kinds of shame and oppression, but they don't talk about it because winning is the most important thing. And I remember seeing on Twitter last week when the Rogan stuff broke, a leftist wrote that even at the end of the day, anybody who listens to Joe Rogan, we still want them to have healthcare and free college and not die in wars. And I don't believe the other side actually wants that for us.
No, they want us to die.
Yeah, they
really think we're terrible.
So it's like if these kind of incel types on Joe Rogan do or these just kind of disenfranchised more than anything. I'm not a big viewer of it, but I kind of dipped into it. These disenfranchised younger white men all of a sudden realize that, hey, this kind of Bernie movement is a leftist movement and it wants your life to be better too. I think our work will be, easier. So.
Yeah.
I'm being quiet.
I
just want to interrupt you for a second to tell you how quiet I'm going to be so that women have equal time.
Well, you are the guest, so the idea is really to pepper you with questions and get your thoughts. We're on here every day, all day long talking. So, but here's a question that came in from the chat that I'm trying to find as we scroll down here, and I'm just continuing to talk so that we fill the time. No, just kidding. Someone asked you, wanted to get your opinion, Charles, about what's happening in where is it? I can't scroll all the way back up to it. I think it was Mr. Decrypting had a left field question about what is happening in I can't scroll all the way up for some reason, about what's happening in with Palestine and Israel. They wanted your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, the simple answer is Palestinians are fucked. That's not about to change anytime soon.
And here it is. I've got the question for you, Charles. Here's the specific. It was Toilet Lurker, one of our regular and poorly named, I must say, stream chatters, but
Michael George.
Beloved nonetheless. Off-topic question for Charles. Here's the exact wording. 70% of Palestinians support a multi-ethnic one-state solution to the conflict with Israel. What should we think about liberal Zionists and two-state solution advocates like Chomsky and Finkelstein, since source for the 70%, and then they gave a 70%, and also thank you for not serving. So I don't know what that is, but you go ahead and take it.
It's a reference to me being a refusenik, which you forgot to mention. Yes, you are a refusenik. So because I was a refusenik in Israel when I was a young person, no one can criticize me for anything ever again. I'm a hero. Screw y'all. Anyway, I don't know if I can give a direct answer to this question, but I want to say the United States is a complete failure at translating majorities on particular policy issues into government action. Complete failure, which is why we don't have Medicare for all, which is why we have such an unequal country. And you think that in Israel and Palestine, which are arguably much worse at democracy or giving a shit about each other, is going to somehow translate majorities of what people want into actual policy? Like, let's lower our standards here. We'd be happy if fewer people were being starved killed, prevented from, traveling from one town to the next. Like we should really lower our standards for what we want to get in the short term. There is an immense amount of suffering and oppression and human rights violations right now. And I'm on the side of people who say, let's work our way out of the hole slowly. That big rainbow that we want to chase of like how everything's going to be exactly the way it should be with justice for all, I'm not sure that's going to be a 21st century thing. That might be that might be a Star Trek scenario. That's sort of one piece of it. The second thing is I have so many fun stories, and I'm going to tell a short one now. I remember participating in a demonstration in Jerusalem against the construction of the wall. The big separation barrier, the apartheid wall, isn't only in the West Bank, it also snakes through Jerusalem, dividing some of the Palestinian neighborhoods from some of the Jewish ones. And there I am with internationals, Israeli Jews, Palestinians from Israel, Jerusalem, the West Bank. We're all protesting and inhaling tear gas and having a grand old time. I climb up to the berm, right? I climb up to this hill right next to it just to get a breather. And there's an old Palestinian gentleman, a local, wearing a traditional, garb. And he's just, standing there with his stick, taking it all in. And a young journalist comes up, and she's like also, thinking of her angle for the story. So she tries to talk to the gentleman. He doesn't speak any English. And she didn't speak any of his languages, which were Arabic and Hebrew. So she asked me, would I agree to translate? Because I was quite obviously an Israeli Jew. So she asks me in English, I translate the question to Hebrew, then he answers, and then I'm giving her, and she's filming this whole thing. So she says the question is, what do you think the peaceful outcome is going to be here? I asked the gentleman in Hebrew. He gives me the answer, and I tell her, as long as Jews are on the Holy Land of Palestine, there will be no peace. And she has this look on her face. Wait, what did I just hear? That's not the narrative I'm trying to present. So she gave me this look like, doesn't that disturb you? Like, she's sort of feeling for me as the intermediary here. And I'm looking at the gentleman. We get each other. It's all good. Like, we're totally friendly in this moment. But I think the gaps of instinct and understanding that exist in that land are so extreme, so beyond the comprehension of Americans and even the American left. It just doesn't make sense to run around saying, hey, I got the solution in my pocket. Let's talk about that. We are so far from that. My biggest piece of advice on the entire topic of Israel and Palestine is lower your expectations. Very little good is going to happen anytime soon.
Charles, what do you think was the end game of President Trump trying to bring that out and parade it out right now? Do you believe that it was just to distract from impeachment? Is he kind of trying to throw favors at his, his buddies in the Middle East? What do you have any thoughts?
My thoughts are that there are some Jewish wealthy people like Sheldon Adelson, but not just, who donate large amounts of money to Republican causes, and that this is a pandering for that support. It's not even support for Jewish votes. Everything about what's happening diplomatically is driven by political concerns in the United States among donors and constituencies in the Republican Trump coalition. To look at this as a diplomatic maneuver and, be like, well, no, Saudi Arabia surprisingly hasn't endorsed it. Saudi Arabia has better things to think about. This has nothing to do with the Middle East and everything to do with Trump's reelection.
Jocelyn or Kelli?
And Netanyahu getting elected, correct?
I don't think Trump, the idea that Trump is like, how do I make sure Netanyahu stays in power? Like, he gives a shit. I mean, that would be out of character for him to care about anyone else, right?
It would be, but he does like his, his gangsters close to him,
I mean, I guess I feel like in the hierarchy, Trump cares a lot more about Sheldon Adelson than Netanyahu. So if being nice to Netanyahu is how he gets Sheldon Adelson's support, then he'll do that. But if Netanyahu was replaced by some other, more or less Israeli right-wing fascist, it's not as though Trump would be saying, I really liked Benny. No, doesn't give a shit.
Yep, he'd be tweeting anti-Netanyahu stuff in no time. You're right.
Charles, is there anything you think you'd like to say as we wrap up this hour, which we really appreciate you being with us for the full hour when you only agreed with us to be with us for 20 minutes?
Well, I forget what I agreed to. I have a really bad memory, but
That's great. We try to just keep it loose in case we're
I-
like, he is terrible. Let's cut him off at 4 minutes.
there we go.
Or he is
Smart.
great. Let's keep him on for an hour.
Very smart. I'll just say, I know all of you, and I really like all of you, and it's great hanging out with you. And I miss the whole team at act.tv.
Well, maybe you should just come on this program a little more often, huh?
No, that's not up to me, is it now?
No, it's up to me.
Watch out
I'm
with
the
the
booker of
timeout.
guests.
No more timeouts.
I
Oh,
feel
we
like I
timed
had
you
something
out.
to say and now I don't remember. Damn it.
Jocelyn, any further things you want to yell at Charles about?
No, Charles, I don't know why you're leaving. I feel abandoned.
You can stay.
He doesn't want to though. Look at that.
I have work that I must do. This is not advancing the Real News's interests quite as much as they would like.
Are you kidding me? You just got 38 new followers.
No, and when I mentioned
the Real
number of
News?
followers, you cut me off, and now you do it, James. That's hypocrisy.
Charles, yes, Charles, what are you covering at the Real News today? What's going on there?
We're talking about the Middle East, about the Trump's peace plan. We're talking about the elections, trying to figure it out. We're thinking about our coverage of Iowa and New Hampshire.
Jocelyn is there if you need someone on the ground.
Yes. Well, the challenge for us is to figure out this organization's in transition, and we're asking the question, what do we want to be known for in terms of our political coverage? There are not only many progressive outlets that do video or progressive news, but there's also many mainstream corporate entities like Vice News or Vox or Teen Vogue that are producing excellent commentary and news. So what is it that we should be doing over time that would get people to think about why we matter and why our fans should be loyal to us? And we're actually trying to figure it out. So if anyone here has ideas of what they think is missing in the landscape, I'd love to hear it. I would like to find a large constituency to pander to. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm around later, Charles, if you would like to talk via phone or internet.
Excellent.
I could also tell you things, but not in public. Excellent.
Whoa,
This is
really
really fun. Thank you so much for being on with us. I appreciate it a lot. Our people will, yes, the Real News, you can go there. Our people will be reaching out for a follow-up interview. Thank you very much, Charles Lenchner. We will see you over at the Real News, and anywhere else interesting, good ideas can be found.
Thank you.